For over 2,000 years, historians assumed the people of ancient France simply farmed their land, buried their dead, and quietly carried on for generation after generation with no real disruption. Then a team of geneticists cracked open 132 skeletons buried inside a single megalithic tomb north of Paris, and the DNA inside them told a completely different story. Within the space of a few centuries, an entire population vanished from the genetic record, replaced almost completely by newcomers from hundreds of miles away. Plague bacteria, axe wounds, collapsing farmland, and a 5,000-year-old family tree are now rewriting exactly what happened to the people who built ancient France, and the full picture is only just now coming into focus. A team of researchers led by geneticist Frederick V. Searsholm at the University of Copenhagen recently completed one of the most detailed ancient DNA studies France has ever seen, and the results, published in the journal Nature, Ecology, and Evolution earlier this year, have quietly overturned decades of assumptions about how prehistoric French society actually functioned. Rather than sampling scattered burials from across the country, the team focused entirely on a single site, a megalithic tomb called Berry, located roughly 50 kilometers north of Paris. What made this site so valuable wasn't just its age. It was the sheer number of individuals buried there and the fact that those burials spanned two clearly separated phases of activity, divided by a gap in use that gave researchers an almost perfect before and after snapshot of a population in the middle of collapsing and being replaced. In total, the team successfully extracted and analyzed genetic material from 132 individuals interred at Bury, an enormous sample size by the standards of ancient DNA research, where studies frequently work with a dozen or fewer usable genomes. That scale alone allowed the researchers to do something most prehistoric population studies simply can't: trace actual family relationships across multiple generations rather than just estimating broad ancestry percentages for isolated individuals. The tomb effectively functioned as a genealogical record book, written not in ink but in bone. And once the team began mapping out who was related to whom, patterns started emerging that nobody studying French prehistory had been able to see clearly before. The earlier of the two burial phases at Bury ended around 3000 BCE, and the people buried during this period showed a genuinely diverse genetic makeup. Some individuals carried detectable traces of hunter-gatherer ancestry, the genetic legacy of the populations who had lived across Europe for tens of thousands of years before agriculture ever arrived. This diversity reflected a society still carrying forward deep, tangled genetic roots stretching back to multiple earlier waves of settlement, rather than a single, uniform founding population. Critically, the burials from this phase also revealed something researchers rarely get to observe directly: real extended family structures with genetic relationships spanning as many as 5 generations within a single kin network, all buried together inside the same monument over time. One particular burial from this earlier phase stands out as a genuinely dramatic piece of physical evidence, the kind of detail that turns an abstract genetic study into something closer to a real human story. Researchers identified 3 brothers among the remains, and one of them had been found seated upright in a corner of the grave, his skull bearing 3 separate axe wounds. Surrounding him were the remains of several children, and the researchers who examined the burial believe this arrangement may represent the founding deposit of the entire monument. The original core burial, around which the rest of the tomb's population was gradually built up over subsequent generations. Whether the axe wounds reflect violence, ritual, or some combination of the two remains genuinely unclear, but the burial itself offers a rare, direct window into a specific family's fate at a specific moment in deep prehistory, rather than simply a percentage on a chart. The second burial phase at Bury tells an almost entirely different story, and the contrast between the two periods is where the study's most significant finding emerges. This later phase ran through much of the 3rd millennium BCE, and when researchers analyzed the genetic ancestry of the individuals buried during this period, they found that more than 80% of their DNA traced directly back to Neolithic populations from the Iberian Peninsula, the region covering modern Spain and Portugal. That figure is enormous. It doesn't represent a gradual blending of two neighboring populations over centuries of intermarriage and cultural exchange. It represents something closer to a wholesale demographic takeover, a population arriving from hundreds of miles to the southwest, and rapidly becoming the overwhelming genetic majority in a region that had, just centuries earlier, been home to a completely different, genetically diverse local population. What makes this finding particularly significant for the broader understanding of European prehistory is the timing. Historians and archaeologists have long known about a major population shift associated with the Bell Beaker cultural phenomenon, a wave of migration and cultural change that swept across Western Europe roughly 4,500 years ago, closely tied to expanding populations carrying substantial ancestry from the Pontic-Caspian steppe region of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The Berry findings show that a major population replacement in France was already well underway before that Bell Beaker wave ever arrived, driven not by steppe migrants moving in from the east, but by an entirely separate population moving up from Iberia in the south. This effectively pushes the timeline of major genetic upheaval in French prehistory back by several centuries, revealing that the region experienced not one, but at least two distinct waves of large-scale population replacement within a relatively short span of prehistoric time. The social organization of the two burial phases at Bury differed just as sharply as their genetic ancestry. The earlier phase, as already noted, reflected large, complex, extended family networks, the kind of tightly interwoven kinship structure you'd expect from a stable, long-established community that had occupied the same landscape for many generations. The later phase looked completely different. Instead of broad extended families, researchers found smaller patrilineal lineages, family lines traced specifically through the father's side, alongside a noticeably higher proportion of individuals who weren't closely related to anyone else buried at the site. This shift in social structure mirrors the genetic shift almost exactly, reinforcing the idea that this wasn't simply cultural change happening within a continuous population, but a fundamentally different society occupying the same physical location after the previous one had largely disappeared. Both burial phases shared one striking demographic feature that immediately caught the research team's attention: a pronounced male bias among the individuals interred at the site, with roughly 71 to 73% of the burials belonging to men across both periods. That kind of consistent imbalance doesn't happen by accident, and the researchers concluded it likely reflects a practice known as female exogamy, a social system in which women routinely left their birth community to marry into other groups, meaning they were typically buried elsewhere in the community they married into rather than alongside the family they were born into. If accurate, this suggests that Bury functioned as something closer to an ancestral seat for specific male lineages, a monument built and maintained across generations specifically to house the bones of men who stayed rooted to the same land, while the women connected to those same families were laid to rest somewhere else entirely, their genetic traces scattered elsewhere across the landscape, and effectively invisible to a study focused on this one location. Perhaps the most unexpected layer of the entire study involves disease, and specifically direct genetic evidence of two dangerous ancient pathogens circulating among the people buried at Bury. Researchers detected the plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, in the remains of 4 separate individuals spread across both burial phases, confirming that this disease, later responsible for some of the deadliest pandemics in recorded human history, was already present and actively infecting populations in prehistoric France, thousands of years before anything resembling written history existed. Alongside the plague bacterium, the team also identified genetic traces of Borrelia recurrentis, the bacterium responsible for louse-borne relapsing fever, a disease that, left untreated, carries a mortality rate somewhere between 15 and 40%. Finding direct physical evidence of both pathogens inside a single prehistoric burial population is genuinely rare, and it adds real weight to the idea that disease wasn't just a background risk for these communities, but an active, recurring threat capable of meaningfully shaping their demographic history. Isotope analysis added yet another layer of evidence to the picture, this time focused on lifestyle rather than kinship or disease. By examining strontium isotopes preserved in the teeth and bones of individuals from both burial phases, researchers were able to estimate how mobile or settled each population's lifestyle actually was during their lives. Since strontium ratios shift depending on the local geology of wherever a person spends their childhood and early life. The data indicated that the Phase 2 population, the group carrying the dominant Iberian ancestry, lived a noticeably more settled existence than the earlier Phase 1 population had. That detail matters because it helps rule out one alternative explanation for the ancestry shift. Rather than representing a small number of highly mobile traders or travelers passing through and leaving a light genetic footprint, the Iberian-descended population appears to have been a genuinely settled, locally rooted community. Exactly the kind of population you'd expect to see if a real demographic replacement, rather than simple cultural contact, had actually taken place. To understand what might have caused an entire farming population to collapse and be replaced so thoroughly, the research team looked beyond the burial site itself, turning to pollen records recovered from sediment cores across the wider Paris Basin, and comparing them against similar pollen data collected from sites in Scandinavia, Denmark, and Germany. Pollen data is one of the most reliable tools archaeologists have for reconstructing ancient land use, since the specific mix of plant species preserved in layered sediment directly reflects whether surrounding land was being actively farmed, grazed, or left to return to forest. Across the region, the pollen record showed a clear and consistent signal. Significant forest regrowth occurring in the gap between the 2 burial phases at Bury, indicating that farmland across a wide swath of Western and Northern Europe was being abandoned on a meaningful scale during exactly this period. Taken together, the combination of plague bacteria, a dangerous relapsing fever pathogen, isotope evidence of shifting settlement patterns, and a continent-spanning pollen record showing widespread agricultural abandonment paints a picture considerably more dramatic than a simple, peaceful population turnover. The researchers concluded that a combination of disease outbreaks, environmental strain, and mounting demographic pressure likely worked together to destabilize and ultimately collapse the original Neolithic farming communities that had occupied the region for well over 1,000 years. That collapse, rather than any single dramatic invasion or conquest, appears to have created the demographic vacuum that allowed a new population, arriving from Iberia, to move in and establish itself as the overwhelmingly dominant genetic presence in the region within a relatively short span of time. This Iberian-driven replacement, significant as it is, represents only the first of at least 2 major population upheavals that reshaped ancient France within the space of a few thousand years, and understanding the second wave requires zooming out to look at what was happening across the rest of Europe at roughly the same broader era. Around 2500 BCE, a new cultural phenomenon began spreading rapidly across Western Europe. Archaeologists now know it as the Bell Beaker Complex, named after a distinctive style of bell-shaped pottery vessels found buried alongside individuals across an enormous geographic range stretching from Iberia through France into the British Isles and across much of Central Europe. For a long time, archaeologists genuinely debated whether the bell beaker phenomenon represented an actual migration of people or simply a shared set of cultural fashions and trade goods spreading between otherwise distinct, unrelated populations, the prehistoric equivalent of a viral trend passing from one region to the next without any accompanying movement of people. Ancient DNA settled that debate decisively, and the answer turned out to be more complicated and more interesting than either simple explanation. Where the bell beaker package first appeared, particularly in regions like the Netherlands and parts of Iberia, it really does appear to have spread initially as a cultural and trade network adopted by existing local populations without any major genetic disruption. But once this beaker cultural package reached Central Europe and collided with populations carrying heavy ancestry from the Yamnaya, a highly mobile pastoralist culture originating on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, stretching across parts of modern Russia and Ukraine, something changed. The beaker phenomenon was picked up by these steppe-descended groups and transformed from a relatively peaceful cultural network into an aggressive, expansionist demographic wave, one that pushed rapidly into northwestern Europe, carrying substantial steppe ancestry along with it. The most extreme documented example of this second wave occurred not in France, but just across the English Channel in Britain, where ancient DNA extracted from skeletal remains shows that within just a few centuries of the beaker migrants' arrival, around 2500 BCE, more than 90% of the existing Neolithic gene pool, the population responsible for constructing Stonehenge and other major monuments, had been almost completely replaced. Archaeologist Barry Cunliffe, reacting to these findings when they first emerged, described the results as genuinely mind-blowing for a field that prided itself on caution, while population geneticist David Reich noted that no researcher, however imaginative, had anticipated steppe ancestry showing up at such overwhelming levels in the British genetic record. France experienced its own significant version of this same steppe-driven demographic shift, though generally with somewhat less extreme replacement percentages than the British case, reflecting France's position as a kind of demographic crossroads sitting between the beaker-associated populations of Iberia and the steppe-descended corded wares populations expanding out of Central and Eastern Europe. A landmark 2020 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, led by researchers analyzing a large data set spanning 7,000 years of French prehistory, captured this steppe-related shift in detailed genetic terms. The study documented individuals like one bell beaker-associated man from northern France, identified in the research by the sample code CBV95, whose genome showed an extraordinarily high proportion of Yamnaya-related steppe ancestry, and who carried a Y chromosome belonging to haplogroup R1b, a specific paternal lineage that would go on to become overwhelmingly dominant across Western Europe in the millennia that followed. That same broader steppe migration wave, researchers have noted, helps explain not just genetic patterns but linguistic ones too, since the spread of Indo-European languages, the language family that eventually gave rise to French, English, and most other European tongues, appears to closely track the same demographic expansion visible in the DNA. Interestingly, later, more geographically detailed research has revealed that this steppe-driven wave didn't sweep across every region of France or of northwestern Europe more broadly with equal force. A 2026 study published in the journal Nature focused on the wetland and riverine regions of the Netherlands, Belgium, and western Germany documented a notable exception to the broader pattern of near-total ancestry turnover seen elsewhere. In these specific lowland areas, a distinctive population carrying unusually high hunter-gatherer ancestry, roughly 50%, persisted for as much as 3,000 years longer than in most other parts of Europe, apparently because local hunter-gatherer descended women were being steadily incorporated into incoming farming and later steppe-descended communities, keeping older genetic lineages alive in these specific pockets long after they had effectively vanished elsewhere. This kind of regional nuance is exactly the sort of detail that broad continent-wide migration narratives tend to flatten out, and it's only become visible thanks to increasingly dense, geographically specific ancient DNA sampling in just the past couple of years. Zooming back out to look specifically at southwestern France and the wider region bordering Iberia, earlier detailed genetic research has shown that the steppe-related ancestry associated with the bell beaker and corded ware phenomena arrived later and had a comparatively smaller genetic impact in this part of the country than it did further north and east. One study analyzing individuals associated with the bell beaker complex in this southwestern region detected steppe ancestry making up roughly 28% of one individual's genome, a real and meaningful contribution, but considerably lower than the levels documented in Britain or northern France during the same general period. This regional variation makes sense geographically. Southwestern France sits closer to Iberia, the source of the earlier population replacement documented at the Bury site, and further from the Central European heartland, where Yamnaya-descended steppe ancestry-heavy populations were expanding most aggressively, meaning different parts of France experienced this broader era of demographic upheaval in genuinely different ways, shaped by their specific geography. What emerges from combining all of this research together, the Bury site excavation, the broader 7,000-year genetic survey of French prehistory, and the more recent geographically fine-grained studies covering the transition into the Bronze Age, is a picture of ancient France considerably more turbulent and dynamic than the relatively static, slow-changing prehistoric society most people probably imagine when they think about life 5,000 years ago. Within the span of roughly 1,000 years, the region experienced at least two entirely separate waves of large-scale population replacement, driven first by newcomers arriving from Iberia, and later by steppe-descended populations expanding out of Central Europe, interspersed with genuine disease outbreaks, agricultural collapse, and shifting social structures that left permanent fingerprints inside the bones of the people who lived through it. None of this complexity was visible to archaeologists working purely from pottery styles, burial goods, and monument architecture, the traditional tools of prehistoric research for most of the 20th century. Pottery can tell you that a new style of vessel appeared in the archaeological record at a certain point in time, but it can't tell you whether that new style arrived because new people moved in, because existing people adopted a new fashion through trade and cultural contact, or because of some combination of both. Only genetic evidence, extracted directly from the bones of the people who actually lived through these transitions, can distinguish between those possibilities with real confidence, and that is precisely why studies like the Bury excavation and the broader French genetic survey have proven so valuable, resolving debates that pottery typology alone had left unsettled for generations of archaeologists. The story these bones tell also carries a certain grim resonance that feels strikingly relevant even now. A stable, long-established farming society, its population weakened by recurring disease outbreaks and mounting environmental pressure on its agricultural base, gradually collapsing and creating space for an entirely new population to move in and take its place, isn't just a distant abstraction confined to 5,000-year-old skeletons. It's a pattern that has repeated itself, in various forms, throughout human history. And seeing it documented with this level of genetic and archaeological precision, right down to a specific family of 3 brothers, buried together with axe wounds in a Paris area tomb, gives that pattern a level of tangible, human-scale detail that's genuinely rare in prehistoric research. It's worth being precise, as always, about exactly what this evidence does and doesn't establish. The researchers behind the Bury study were careful to note that the exact mechanism connecting disease, environmental collapse, and population replacement remains an area of ongoing investigation, rather than a fully solved equation. The presence of plague and relapsing fever bacteria in the remains confirms these diseases were circulating among the population, but it doesn't, on its own, prove that disease outbreaks were the single decisive cause of the region's demographic collapse, as opposed to one contributing factor among several working together. Similarly, while the pollen evidence clearly shows widespread agricultural abandonment occurring across a broad swath of Western and Northern Europe during this period, pinning down the exact local causes behind that abandonment in any specific region remains a genuinely difficult task, one that will likely require additional ancient DNA sampling from sites across France and neighboring countries before researchers can offer a fully confident, detailed explanation. What is considerably more settled and independently confirmed across multiple, separate research teams working with different sample sets and different statistical methods is the basic shape of the overall story. Ancient France was not a single, continuously occupied population quietly evolving in place across thousands of years, but a landscape that experienced at least two major genetically documented population replacements within a relatively compressed span of prehistoric time, first from the south, driven by Iberian newcomers, and later from the east, driven by steppe-descended populations carrying the ancestry that would eventually dominate genetic and linguistic patterns across most of Western Europe. Every individual burial recovered from sites like Bury adds another small, specific piece of evidence to that larger picture, gradually replacing vague generalizations about ancient farmers and prehistoric migrations with something considerably closer to an actual, dated, genetically documented historical record. For a period of human history with no writing, no names, and no surviving first-hand testimony of any kind, that level of specificity is genuinely remarkable. Modern researchers can now say with real scientific confidence that a particular family of brothers were buried together in a specific tomb north of Paris around 5,000 years ago, that one of them died from repeated blows to the skull, that the community around them was later replaced by a population arriving from hundreds of miles to the south, and that this new population was itself later absorbed or displaced by yet another wave of migrants, carrying ancestry from the distant steppes of Eastern Europe. None of that story existed in any history book a decade ago. It exists now, purely because a small number of research teams were willing to spend years extracting fragile, degraded genetic material from 5,000-year-old bones, and because the technology to actually read what that genetic material contained finally caught up to the scale of the questions researchers were asking. The Bury excavation, published as recently as this year, is also a useful reminder that this field is still moving quickly, and that the picture of ancient European prehistory continues to change in real time as new sites are excavated and new genomes are sequenced. Findings that seemed settled just 5 or 10 years ago, particularly around the exact timing and mechanism of the Bell Beaker expansion, have already been meaningfully revised by more recent, more detailed research, and there's no reason to expect that process to slow down anytime soon. Every new megalithic tomb excavated, every new burial site sampled, carries the potential to reveal another chapter of this story that nobody currently studying French prehistory has any way of anticipating in advance. If a story like this, where genetics quietly rewrites what an entire ancient civilization actually experienced, using nothing but the DNA locked inside 5,000-year-old bones, is the kind that stays with you, stick around, because this field is producing findings at a pace that shows no sign of slowing down, with new studies routinely overturning assumptions that had gone unquestioned for decades. And if there's a specific ancient population, migration, or unresolved historical mystery you've always wanted properly examined against the actual evidence, drop it in the comments, because that's exactly where the next story like this one tends to come from.